All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and call the Striped Bass Board to order this afternoon. So we're going to start with approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or modifications to the agenda? Seeing none, I will just note, I think John Clark had one item under other business that we'll get to. Moving on to our next item, it's approval of proceedings from March 2024. Are there any edits to the proceedings from March of 2024? Seeing none, the proceedings will be approved by consent. So we'll now move into public comment. This is for comment on items that are not on the agenda, and I'll look for raised hands both in the room and on the webinar, and we'll see how many folks would like to give public comment. I am not seeing any hands online or in the room, so just double checking that. Seeing none, we will move on to our agenda item, which is to consider the revised addendum to state implementation plans, and we will be hopefully taking action on this today. So just a reminder to the board of where we've been on this agenda item. States were required to implement the addendum to measures by today, which is May 1st. We had a March webinar board meeting where the board approved the addendum to state implementation plans with 3 exceptions. Which were Pennsylvania's timeline for implementing its new spring slot limit and Maryland and Potomac River Fisheries Commission timeline for paying back any potential commercial quota overages from 2024. So to address those issues, the 3 jurisdictions have submitted revised state implementation plans, and those were included in your meeting materials today. We're going to be considering final action to approve those 3 revised implementation plans. So I'm just going to go to each of the 3 jurisdictions to provide a brief recap of what has changed in their implementation plan since March, and then we'll open it up for any board discussion. So I will start with Ingrid. Would you like to start? Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. PRFC submitted a plan to revise the commercial overage payback that we believe would satisfy the F&P requirement to pay back in the next fishing year. So in our plan, we detailed the specifics of our tag distribution and our timing so that at our Commission's September and December meetings, they would consider the projections for the 2024 fishing year and take action in either delaying issuing tags for the next year or reducing the amount of tags based on those projections. And I would be happy to take any questions based on what I submitted. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. I'm going to go through the 3 states and then we'll open it up for questions after those 3 states. So next I'll go to Mike Louisi from Maryland.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So our revised plan differs slightly from what the Potomac River Fisheries has put forth. So if it's okay with you, I'll just step through a few of the details. And so just to bring everybody up to speed, all of our recreational measures are in effect as of today. They go into effect today. And so what I'd like to focus on is what we were able to come up with for a revised plan based on the feedback that we got at the board meeting in March. And so we got a lot of suggestions in March, things to think about. And I spent time with my staff working through the different suggestions that were made. And we concluded that there were a couple of the suggestions that we just can't do. And so I wanted to spend a second highlighting that to let you know that we did discuss it, but things like reducing the 2024 quota post sending it out to our fishermen is something that we just can't do. We can't pull back the quota that was already distributed in 2024. And so just for clarity, just for transparency, we have more quota out there this year than Addendum 2 requires. But we're going to allow that fishery to operate this year. And part of our revised plan and the details that I'm going to go through help address how we would handle potential overages. So that's something that we could not do. Another thing that we can't do is hold quota, hold tags, and do multiple rounds of distributing the permits to our ITQ holders. I detailed it in the revised plan, so I'm not going to spend the time addressing all of the reasons why, but it comes down to staff resources and the time that it would require and the complexity that would occur as a result of us going through the motions of multiple mailings, however you want to think about it. You know, getting the quote out in different stages throughout the course of the year is just something that we can't do. But what we can do, is we can focus on more timely and accurate understanding of the catch throughout the year, and I think you'll see that as the highlight in our revised plan. And so what happens in our state is that for each fish that's caught, the fish have to go through what we refer to as check stations, and there are 33 of those check stations all throughout the state of Maryland. And the check stations act as as kind of a branch or an arm of the Natural Resources Department in verifying what has been harvested and then reporting that harvest to us on a weekly basis. So much more timely than the annual reporting that's required under the ITQ. And so what our plan is in moving forward is that we are going to stay on top of our check station reporting this year, more so than we have in the past. We're going to pay particular attention to the catch in 2024 around the December 1st time period this year. So when we get to December, we're going to have a pretty good handle on what has been caught to date. And then we're going to use a projection of the month of December to take an educated guess as to how many fish will be caught during that month. And we're going to add it to the catch that we already know occurred. That number that we generate from that is what we're going to use as a projected 2024 harvest. If the projected 2024 harvest is greater than Addendum 2's 2024 quota, we will reduce the amount of the Addendum 2 2025 quota by that overage amount. So if fishermen are catching more than what they should have caught under Addendum 2 right now, that will be deducted from the future Addendum 2 quota. As the year progresses into 2025, we'll have a better handle on actual catch, and we'll consider all of what we've distributed, what's been harvested, and make any slight adjustments that still might be necessary, but that will not be able to be adjusted until 2026. And while we realize that was the whole reason why we were here, is because our original plan was asking to be allowed to take the full brunt of the reduction in 2026, we might be dealing with very small numbers of just making sure that our numbers are all aligned for our compliance report. So that is our plan moving forward. We appreciate the board's interest in assuring that we are following along with the FMP as it states. And like Ingrid, I'll be happy to take any questions on the details of that plan following Pennsylvania's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So now go to Chris Kuhn from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So appreciate the opportunity to go through Pennsylvania's revisions to the implementation plan that was presented back in March. We submitted a revised implementation plan for consideration of the board, and without going through all the details, the sticking point with the previous plan was the implementation timeline, where I was proposing to implement following the May 1st time period. We have since been able to comply with that. A notice of the change has been posted in the Pennsylvania Bulletin on April 20th, I believe, and signs were physically posted in the vicinity of the the area affected by the rule change yesterday and today, and that's the last piece of Pennsylvania's regulations to become compliant. So as of today, we are compliant with the change, and the proposed slot limit that was enacted was a change to the spring slot fishery from the 21 to 24 inch 2 fish bag limit to the 22 to 26 inch 1 fish bag limit, which has an estimated reduction of 19.2 or 32%. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So we're now going to open it up for any board questions and discussions on the 3 revised implementation plans. And after that, we'll be looking for a motion. So any questions? Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Should we direct our questions through you? How do you want to proceed here?
Sure, I think you can ask your questions and I'll just look to the specific state to respond.
So my question for Maryland is, in the past, have you been able to track how closely the data from the 33 check stations, how close they are to what the final commercial landings are for the state after everything is resolved? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Emerson. Yes, we can. There are sometimes some discrepancies between what is reported by the fishermen when they send in their annual report or their harvest report on their permit, and what the check stations have reported. But those discrepancies are handled outside of, they're dealt with, and and then we move on. But the discrepancies it's not a rampant practice. They occur like anything when you're dealing with 1,000 fishermen, 33 check stations, an open season that probably runs close to 250 days a year. We've got some line by line comparisons that we have, but I would not say they're significant in any way.
Have a follow-up, Emerson? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Mike, for that explanation. But I guess what I was really asking is, over the course of some number of years, has the data from those 33 check stations represented about 90%, 95%, 99%, 100% of what the final commercial landings are for the state? Is that more clear?
Yeah, they represent 100%.
All right. Next, I had David Borden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Emerson just asked the first question, but Mike, is the information from the check station going to be public information? Is going to be on like a website so the public could see what the catch is to date, like a running tally?
We don't currently have a system like that set up, but I mean, we could consider putting something online similar to how other quotas are tracked, where the public could watch the quota as it's caught. I don't know. It's public information. The summary of the collection of all 33 reports goes into a daily catch, and that could be posted. We'd have to consider.
Yeah, I just offered the opinion. I think it would be useful if you could do that. Thank you.
Any other questions? And at this point, we'll also take any comments folks have. Seeing none, I would be looking for a motion to approve the implementation plans. Mike Armstrong.
Thank you. Since I made the motion to cause this action, I think it's appropriate. In the spirit of collegiality and interstate cooperation, as represented by this august body, I make a motion to approve the revised addendum to implementation plans for Pennsylvania and the Potomac River Fisheries Commission and Maryland.
Thank you, Mike Armstrong. And I saw a lot of seconds. Mike Louisi, I think you had your hand up first. All right, so we have a motion on the board that's made by Mike Armstrong, seconded by Mike Louisi. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing no discussion, is there any opposition to this motion? Seeing none, the motion passes by unanimous consent. All right, so we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is a presentation from Mike Armstrong on fisheries release mortality study that Mass DMF is doing. And as Mike walks up here, I think our plan for the rest of our agenda today is Mike will give his presentation. We'll have opportunity for questions for Mike, but I'd like to hold discussion on kind of the general topic of discard mortality or release mortality until after our next agenda item, which is talking about the work group.
Thank you. I'm going to give a very brief, I'm just going to whip through in the interest of time. I always say that, but give me the cut when I go too long. Of some of the work we've been doing on catch and release mortality, I apologize. These slides are ugly, but they were very pretty, but I couldn't get them to email to Emily, so I had to make them ugly and cut out everything. So what we've been doing is really 3 different phases that I think you want to hear about. So phase 1 was looking at the efficacy of circle hooks. And this followed us. We put in a mandatory rule, but there wasn't a ton of empirical evidence that these circle hooks work. There's a couple of unpublished studies. So we undertook that. And I'll tell you about that. And then phase 2, we took data from there, created a model, and put in a citizen science collection program that is just generating crazy data. That's really good. And then I'll tell you about a survey we're going to do to try and ground truth some of these things. I'd be remiss, Micah Dean, Bill Hoffman, Ben Gahagan, and others, I just fund the things and tell them to do it. And they just did unbelievable work getting this all done. So anyway, the efficacy of circle hooks. So what's the conservation benefit? There were 2 studies, Caruso and Lukakovic, that looked at this. They were never published. They're deep in the gray literature, and they used cages, and they found significant benefits to circle hooks. And I think that motivated this board to move forward with that. There are lots of studies on other species, primarily billfishes, that works pretty well. And there's a huge amount of literature on it. But there's also some where they didn't work that well. And it was primarily fish that don't attack the bait like a billfish. So what was the objective? Do circle hooks reduce release mortality? And what would the factors be that cause this mortality that's being reduced by circle hooks? So we undertook this study. We actually did 1 year of it. We chose a circle hook, and we went to our bait and tackle shops and said, what's the most popular circle hook that you use? Because we wanted to simulate that. And then we said, what's the most popular bait? And so we wound up modeling what we did after the most popular fishing methods in Massachusetts, which is live mackerel and certain circle hooks. Well, at the end of year 1, the results were perplexing. So I immediately said, let's do it again with more hooks, different hooks. So we wound up using 3 different circle hooks versus 1 J hook. And the results were interesting. So anyway, we recorded a bunch of data, typical length, but things like the hook location, the fight time, the handling time, and the release condition, a whole bunch of things we recorded. One of the more important being the condition score, 1 being no visible injury except maybe a little hole in the lip, and it swims off rapidly and strongly. 2 and 3 are somewhere between uninjured, and 4 is near death or almost dead, incapable of swimming away. So it's subjective, but it turned out it worked really well. So we attached accelerometer tags. So they're the standard pinging tags. We sew them on their back. and deployed a whole bunch of receivers. Now, the cool thing about these tags is, the same thing that's in your phone. So when you tip it, it changes the screen. It's an accelerometer, except this records tail beats. And so you can actually tell if the fish is swimming, more or less, which we thought was a huge advantage over the way things have been done. Throw them in a cage and open it up 3 days later and see who's alive. So we released about 350 fish with tags on them over 2 years. And we put out an array. So this is Salem Sound. The Cat Cove lab that I oversee is in this picture. But the outer ones form a gate. So it's very difficult for a bass to leave that area without us seeing it. And for those, I think everyone's familiar, but these things are pinging. They're pinging an identifier, and then they're pinging all the accelerometer data. And so they're going to be picked up. The very low probability of not being picked up in this array. And the bass, once they're in Massachusetts, they don't move that much out of where they set up for a while. So that was the primary array, and that is the summer foraging area for our bass. And then, of course, many of you have some in your state, and we are part of an East Coast consortium, if you will, where we all share data that we pick up on our receivers, and it works tremendously. So a lot of our bass, if for some reason they escaped our detections, they would not escape probably others that other states have put out. So we did it, we put them out, and what happened? Well, so anyway, turns out dead fish move. And they move quite a bit. So we could not tell live from dead for almost 2 weeks. And we theorized that it's the dead body, if you will, is being pushed around by tide, currents, and everything else. And so you can see on the bottom graph, there's quite a bit of activity from the accelerometer. So we wound up auditing the data and not using anything before 2 weeks. That was interesting finding. We think eventually that the local fauna takes care of it, and once the tag falls off the fish, because it's mostly eaten, then it becomes stationary, and then we can say it's truly dead. So most fish, if they died, it became very clear. There were some that were ambiguous. But the results of it all these parameters we put in a big model, and this is some of the findings. So our condition factor made sense after we looked at the data. If it swam off and it was doing well and it was essentially uninjured, there's a 1% chance of it dying, essentially no chance of it dying. If it was a little bit hurt, 9%. And if it was fairly hurt, but it swam off maybe weakly, 44% died. And then, of course, if it looked dead, it was dead. So that condition score became very valuable. It was the most significant factor in the model. In fact, you could predict just using condition. So this is it here on the left. You see the J hook is furthest on the left of the left graph, and that's percent mortality. What you see is there is no statistical difference in the death rate for the 3 circle hooks we used. The other interesting part is the 9% we use in the assessment looks pretty damn good. So that was a good finding. The other piece, so the right graph is, and we could look at this in lots of different ways. Here's unhooking time. So the longer it takes to unhook, the higher mortality goes. That's kind of a no-brainer. but it's exacerbated when the fish are more injured, particularly if a fish is injured in the gill. There's a very high probability it's going to die. And the longer you keep it out of the water, that probability goes up. So that was the finding of our study. So why was there no circle hook effect? We have a paper coming out, and this is the part where we wave our arms a little in the discussion. Other papers had seen it. So our goal was to use the most popular hooks that were being used in live bait. And it could very well be that those hooks aren't the best. They're just popular and they don't work well. We're not sure. The Caruso paper, you can see on the bottom, had a very small gap. And it could be that these popular ones, they're actually octopus circles, have a larger gap. And so they're just not working as well as the ones that Caruso used. So it could be, so we're not prepared to sit here and say circle hooks don't work. I think they do work under certain circumstances. And you have to figure everyone who was fishing, we were paying attention, we were experienced anglers. If you put your rod in a rod holder and drink beer and let 200 yards of line run out, circle hooks probably work better. We did not test that scenario. And we could only test a very limited number of scenarios. So our conclusion is they didn't work, but there's probably a hook that does, and they're probably beneficial under different circumstances. So I don't think we should be in a rush to take that rule back because they work so well for so many things. But it's real data, and under these circumstances, they didn't work right. This might be one, there should be some follow-up studies looking at that gap and working with manufacturers to maybe do a hook that works better, but that'll take some work. So let me move on. So all that data allowed us to build this model with the predictive ability of, is it going to die? But we didn't have the capability of looking at lures, all the treble hooks, single hooks, combination, and all that. So we came up with the idea of using citizen science, have citizens collect as simple as we can the parameters that we looked at. And so we're calling the comparison of release, injury, or mortality from various terminal tackle using citizen science from this predictive mortality model. So we put out a call for our anglers to help us out, and they responded pretty well. We got, I think I have it here. So 689 signed up, but a quarter of those actually submitted data. But I'll show you, this is data on 3,000 fish. So it's a lot, as much as my staff would love to spend the rest of their career striped bass fishing. This is probably a more effective way to do it. So I've actually approached a lot of your states to try and get more data from other states. I'll show you some of the reasons we'd like to see other types of gear, particularly other water temperatures. But you can see it's mostly from Massachusetts, and they're mostly experienced anglers, and they fished a lot. So, you know, that can bias results too. So we have to watch out for that. So it's all reported through a website, and the data is updated constantly. And I should have put the website in so you guys could, you can go right now and you can watch all the graphs, and they change daily when the season gets going. Let's see. Well, yeah, this isn't that important. I'll move on from here. But 882 trips we sampled, and 3,500 fish reported on condition fight time, et cetera. So what did we find so far? So let me stop there. So we did it the first year. We did some of our own sampling and we had all those anglers, but we decided we needed a lot more data. So we've approached some of you states to help us out, and we'll be doing it again. And so we hope to have, if we got 3,000 fish, we're hoping maybe 10,000 fish. That'll be a lot of data, and that'll be very telling. And I'll show you some of the stuff that we're getting out of it now. So anyway, the bait or lure choices as reported, and this isn't stratified or anything. This is just raw. This is what they reported. You can see midwater lures were the most popular. Bait was also popular. But those were the big categories: surface, midwater, bottom, fly, and bait. And most of the bait up our way was mackerel, and it was live mackerel. So here's some of the data. I'm just going to whip through it. The size varies according to gear. That's kind of a no-brainer. You fly guys catch little dinky fish, and a lot of them. And larger lures catch larger fish. Imagine that. So the graphs on the left are pretty cool. Bigger fish take longer time to handle, and that's significant because big fish don't do well out of the water and being handled roughly. But the data on the right are this is fight time, and it's done by how well it swam off. So it swam off either strong, which is the white part of the bar, weak, or it didn't swim off. And so you can see how they were all ranked, and the bottom was handling time. So as handling time or fight time goes up, you have more fish that are incapacitated in some way. Not surprising, but we can look at it more. The one on the left is by gear type and where it was hooked. So white was in the mouth, and then you can see body is the pinkish one. So surface lures catch the body or the face or something, and it's generally 2 treble hooks. So they're the worst. About 20% of all fish are foul hooked, if you will, on surface lures. And I'll show you the data that shows that it's mostly double treble hooks. And then you look down the bottom at bait, and you see the other problem, and that's the darker red is esophagus. And it's survivable, but it's injured at that point. Let's see. Yeah, I won't bother going over there. But you see, these graphs are all automatically made on the website, and this is pretty cool. So here we are looking at the hook combination. So a single hook, a single treble, two single hooks, two treble hooks, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that the treble and treble sticks out, way out. Black is in the gill, and what we found is if a fish is caught in the gill and it's bleeding, it is almost surely going to die. So if you had to point to a combination, it would be a surface lure with 2 treble hooks is the most problematic in terms of injuring fish that you're trying to put back in the water. And then, okay, the one on the right, and this is just the way we can parse things out. This is how much blood there is. So the treble caused the most bleeding. And that goes with the left graph too. And then there's ancillary data that we're collecting for temperature, air, and water. We ask people to take. So you can see one of the problems, you look at our water temperature and it barely touches 70 at the peak of the summer. And that's why we're looking to you folks to help us out with some some more data, because if you look at the graph on the right, water temperatures on the y-axis, and did it swim off strongly, weakly, or it didn't swim off at all. And you can see that it's almost a threshold effect. We think that once you get over about 75, that's when you start seeing the injury or the ability to, swim off really goes downhill. So we don't have a ton of data. You can see the sample size next to them. We simply didn't have water greater than 75 very much. So it'll be really interesting to get some from your states. But it's interesting that there seems to be a threshold effect. Overall, if we look at the mortality rate, keeping in mind we used 9, forget the stuff on the left, the ones on the right, let's look at by lure type. So fly is, boy, I can't even read it. Fly is 3% and bait is almost 7%. So there's considerable reduction by eliminating certain things like bait, but I'm just giving our next conversation. I think there's a lot of data here that will be useful for that conversation. And then by hook type, you can see the treble is above 8%, far to the right. So that's the highest mortality rate there. And again, we have data to look at in a million different ways. So when we conclude it's efficient and effective method of collecting these data, and we incentivized it with supplying a lot of sampling kits with stopwatches and measuring tapes. And we do a raffle, I think, every week. And that, we spent probably $25,000 on that. So we're expanding our outreach to get to other states. And overall, lures have a much lower mortality rate than bait. So that was our conclusion thus far. So just very briefly, so what good are those data? They're not that good unless you know how much people are using each gear. And then the stock assessment people can then parse out mortality like that. So we're about to start a survey through a company that is very experienced at trying to get these kind of data. It's expensive. We'll probably spend $80,000 to get this survey done, but it will absolutely be usable by this board should you go down the route to try to do something about terminal tackle and things like that. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Mike. So we're gonna go out to the board. There was a ton of information in that presentation. So focus on questions, and then we're gonna save kind of the broader release mortality discussion for our next agenda item. So any questions for Mike? Yeah, we'll start with Dennis Abbott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For Mike, I notice on the last page, it says randomly select X number of email addresses from license ring. Does this mean you're going to restrict this to Massachusetts residents? I've already had a reply from a former commissioner interested in participating from New Hampshire.
Yeah, I mean, the citizen science will be for everyone. Our intent is that this will be a coast-wide survey, so that it'll be usable by this board, should we decide to parse things out. I mean, the end result is we can say 25% were caught by bait and, et cetera, et cetera. And so then we can assign individual mortality rates. It's a big lift, and I hope it all works, but we're going to do it.
All right. I have Steve Train and then Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mike, first I want to thank you for the presentation and thank you for telling me that the way I go fishing, by just letting a couple 100 yards of line go and sit back drinking a beer, would work with those hooks. That's important to me.
I believe. Are you drinking beer? Because it work even better.
Secondly, I misunderstood something at the bottom, I think. At the end, you said that Lures with treble hooks, 2 treble hooks were the most deadly or dangerous, risk of mortality. But the final thing you said was bait was more likely to cause mortality than lures. So is it just that individual lure that was the problem and the rest are okay? I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, it is. In a comparison of lures versus bait, bait has a higher probability of causing mortality. But then if you just look at lures, it's the surface lures with 2 treble hooks that are much worse. But it's comparable to bait individually, if that makes sense. And again, we're still trying to digest all this stuff, but there's a lot of data here.
All right, Mike Louisi and then Roy Miller.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, Mike, this was a lot of really good information. And one thing that as you went through the slides, it showed a graph of handling time. And as handling time increases, mortality increases with it. Did you do any type of comparison between being able to release that hook, whether it's a J hook or a circle hook? We get a lot of folks complaining that circle hooks are just harder to get out of the fish because of the way they're designed. They come out more difficultly. I don't know if you took a look at that, but it might be interesting to see whether or not using the circle hooks when bait is being used actually does help. Just the mechanism itself, is it increasing that handling time? Just something to think about.
Yeah, no, we have the data is in there. We haven't analyzed any of the citizen science stuff because we know we're going to continue. So there's no analysis, but the data is buried in there that we could easily do that.
Just a quick follow-up, Madam Chair. Thank you. Another thing, Mike, you mentioned at the end that you were trying to get to some information regarding the terminal gear that's being used. And at the risk of saying, I believe that we in Maryland did a slight 2 or 3 question add-on to our APIS program for a number of years to try to get to that, to try to figure out what type of tackle anglers were using. And it may be another course for you. Instead of spending the money to do a full-blown survey, you might be able to get it right through the program that you're already working through.
Yeah, that's curious because we tried to do that and MRIP yelled at us.
Yeah, you can't add it. You can't change the form. We had a separate form, and after the conclusion of the interview, we would ask if they would be willing to spend another minute answering some direct questions from the state of Maryland, and we were able to accomplish that with the same staff that we already had in the field. So.
And MRIP knew that?
Yeah, they knew it.
You sure about that?
And if they, yeah, and if they didn't know it, I'm sure I'll be caught in the hallway in a few minutes.
All right, I have Roy Miller and then Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for this very interesting study report, Mike. I may have missed this, but the hooks that were used in the phase 2 study, were all of the bait hooks circle hooks, or were they any type of hook?
For the citizen science part,
Yes.
it's whatever people are using, they
Okay.
report on.
All right, so there was no requirement to use circle hooks for that bait study.
No, we do request them to take a picture and measure the hook if they can, and some people do. So we have information on the hook type.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know. Thanks.
Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, did I disconnect myself here? Am I still? I'm good. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And Mike, thank you for that presentation. Really, really great study. So just a comment. So I did a discard mortality study about 10 years ago on summer flounder in the trawl fishery. And I find some very similar results here with your study with striped bass. So you said that condition and time out of the water were significant factors. Test, am I okay? That condition and time out of the water were significant factors. And then also that longer fight time and handle time resulted in worse condition. And that correlates really well with what I found with summer flounder discard mortality in the trawl survey. And that the worse, because we had a condition index as well. So the worse the condition was of the fish, the less likely it was to survive. And then also with time out of the water, we did different times on deck. And, the longer you left that fish on deck, be exposed to the sun and try to breathe air, the worse the survival was as well. And then also tow time, we did variable tow times, which kind of correlates to your longer fight time. So just wanted to highlight that, similar results between my study with summer flounder discard mortality and what you're seeing with striped bass. But thanks for the great study, Mike.
Yeah, none of this is like groundbreaking, like, oh my God, except for the part that circle hooks didn't seem to work that well under those conditions. But we need empirical data. We need real data if we're going to move ahead with specifying gear types and things like that. So that's good.
Next, I have Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Chair. Mike, really nice work, which isn't surprising. You had a pretty good team on there. So nice work. Appreciate you showing us as well. So I was wondering a little, fantastic descriptive statistics for the citizen science stuff. Is the plan to kind of let it roll for another year and then begin to kind of look at it statistically? So, it looked like there was a couple of cases where there are differences, but, you want to verify that statistically. So is the plan to do that? And then just to add on, do you intend on publishing any of that? Because I can see this information being really valuable to the stock assessment.
Yeah, our intent is, one, to work really closely with this board and the technical committee and get stuff to you all if you need it. But no, we want to finish another year and then start doing the analyses, pick whatever parameters we think and do some statistics on it and publish it. But that'll take a while, but we'd like the data to be available before then. I mean, that's the next conversation is the citizen science, it'd probably be 3 years before it comes out published, just the way it works, but we can get the data to you guys before then.
All right. Next, I have John Clark and then Marty Gary.
Thank you, Chair. And that was an amazing presentation, Mike. Really interesting stuff. Just wanted to clarify a couple of things. When you said the current circle hooks are not the same as the ones that were used 20 years ago, are these ones that qualify as non-offset circle hooks, but they're just different gapped than the old ones?
Exactly. Yeah, they're non-offset and they're popular. I believe these are all called Octopus. I don't use them. I use the one that worked last study. They're more robust. They're kind of a commercial hook. But I think, yeah, the only difference was that the gap was bigger.
And then with the bait, was it live bait and chunk bait combined, or was there a difference between live bait and non-live bait?
There was. We did mostly live. If we couldn't get it, we'd use chunk, but chunk had higher mortality. And that's just because they can swallow a chunk better than a whole mackerel. But to go back to there is no standard for circle hooks, so every manufacturer makes them different. The ultimate goal is to identify what is the factor, and maybe you got to close the gap up. You might lose some fish that way, but you're almost guaranteed to catch it in the lip if it's constructed right, we think.
So our definition that we've put out there about the non-offset circle hook is not prescriptive enough to get to the type of hook we need.
That's what the paper will say. I do believe you have to qualify it with under the circumstances. We tested it and that's all we could do. They didn't work.
So Marty Gary and then Dave Sikorsky online.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks, Mike, and all the folks at Mass DMF for a great study, great work. One of the studies you cited was Lukakovic, Maryland. I kept thinking back to that study which I participated in and some of the formidable environmental conditions with high water temperature and low salinity related to handling time. And I was just thinking, did you and your colleagues have any preliminary thoughts on in-water release related to, mitigating the handling time? Maybe it's just too preliminary for that kind of discussion.
I think you're asking, don't take the fish out of the water. That clearly would be better if the handling time out of the water is 0. And the other things we haven't even looked, but the data there is air temperature. I'm sure that's a cofactor that we can look at too.
Dave Sikorsky.
Thank you. I was going to ask a similar question to what Marty asked, but I'll make it more specific. Did you use any sort of commonly used grippers or things that hold fish out of the water, like a boga grip or a lip grip type thing? And if not, is there a way we could incorporate that type of question into something as we broaden this effort up and down the coast? Because I'd like to definitely be involved in expanding the word in Maryland. I was happy to see that we ticked up a little bit above some of those other states. And I know we have some folks that are really interested in this topic. I know there's also somebody in the meeting today in the room who's leading some work similar here in Maryland that CCA is involved in, to Dr. Nelson. So anyway, very interested. I'm wondering if the handling piece and the commonly used gear component is considered or should be considered.
Now that you mention it, I think it should be considered. I don't think that was recorded. My staff's probably listening, going out of their minds right now, but I do not believe we recorded that, but it sounds like something we should add in.
Thanks.
So Pat Gears, the last hand I saw, and then we're going to move on to our next agenda.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. Mike, this is really great work, and I just want to talk about the telemetry arrays and how important that they are. I just got a text from one of my staff. 3 of your fish showed up off our array at the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. So 3 of your fish made it all the way down to Virginia. They made it through the gauntlet. In addition to that, fish that we're tagging on the James River are going up and summering off of Long Island and Massachusetts and making their way back the following winter, and we're seeing them. So this data, what you're doing is great, and the telemetry work that we're doing, we're seeing so much more coming out of that. So, and we're really interested in this study. I think this is you did a really great job on this.
Thanks. I like the plug for if any state is considering defunding deploying receivers, don't. They're tremendously useful.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for pulling that presentation together. And thanks for everyone at Mass DMF that's been working on this. That was really great to learn. So we're going to move on to our next agenda item, which is discussing a recreational release mortality work group. So bringing us back to the January 2024 policy board meeting, it was agreed that a board work group could be formed to discuss this issue. But before that work group proceeds, the board needs to identify specific tasks that the work group would address. So Emily's going to give a brief presentation summarizing our past discussions on recreational release mortality, and then we'll open it up for board discussion with our goal today on agreeing on a list of tasks for this work group.
Thank you, Chair. So to inform the board's discussion of this release mortality topic, I put together a summary of recent board consideration of release mortality, which was included in the meeting materials. So I'll review some highlights from that summary and some potential tasking questions that the chair has put forward for the board's discussion. So again, we're all familiar with the background here. Since 1990, roughly 90% of all striped bass caught recreationally were released alive, and we apply that 9% release mortality rate to those live releases. And release mortality has been a large portion of the overall striped bass removals, in particular from 2017 to 2021. That number of fish removed via release mortality was higher than the number of fish harvested. So recreational release mortality could be addressed through measures that would increase the chance of survival after a striped bass is released. So for example, particular gear restrictions, or through effort controls in the form of seasonal closures to reduce the number of trips interacting with striped bass, and so to reduce the overall number of striped bass that are released alive. So the board has sort of previously discussed these two different routes through Amendment 7. So starting with the gear restriction component here. So back through Addendum 6, Addendum 6 implemented the first requirement specifically to address recreational release mortality, which is that requirement to use non-offset circle hooks when fishing for striped bass with bait. And this measure was later clarified. We added a definition of bait, and we also provided an exemption for artificial lures with bait attached. And then through Amendment 7, a couple of years later, the board added another gear restriction prohibiting the use of gaffs when fishing recreationally, and also requiring that any striped bass caught on an unapproved method of take must be released immediately. So through the Amendment 7 development process, the plan development team did put forward 3 additional potential gear restriction options that the board ultimately chose to remove from consideration before the draft amendment went out for public comment. Those options were to consider prohibiting treble hooks, consider requiring barbless hooks, and consider prohibiting trolling with wire for striped bass. The board did, as I mentioned, remove these from the document before it went out for public comment. The board noted the complexities of managing specific gear requirements, considering the variation of striped bass fishing techniques along the coast. And there were also some questions about the measurable benefit of potential gear restrictions. The board also noted that outreach and education would be an important alternative if gear restrictions weren't implemented to promote best handling practices. And just sort of in general, the benefit of gear restrictions, so trying to quantify how many fish would be saved by a potential gear restriction is really difficult to quantify. So we don't know how many anglers are already using certain gear types. So how many anglers were already using circle hooks before the requirement was put in. We don't know what the non-compliance rate is. And there are also enforcement challenges in general related to proving, what species an angler was targeting. So moving on to the outreach and education portion, both Addendum 6 and Amendment 7 encourage states to continue developing outreach and education campaigns both on the benefits of circle hooks and sort of general striped bass, best handling and release practices. The board did have a discussion through the Amendment 7 process about whether to require outreach and education as part of the FMP, but the board ultimately decided that it would be really difficult to define what a required outreach program would look like. So the FMP should encourage that outreach and education, and also that most states were already implementing various outreach and education campaigns. So the next sort of approach to potentially reducing release mortality is to reduce the number of live releases overall. So that could be through seasonal closures. And the board has discussed several times sort of the 2 different types of seasonal closures. There's the no harvest closure, where catch and release fishing would still be allowed, but harvest would be prohibited. and then no targeting closures. So no person could take or attempt to take or target a striped bass. So there are a few points of consideration that have been discussed throughout these past board discussions. First, that for any type of closure, fishing trips that are targeting other species that incidentally release striped bass, those trips would still occur. So that would affect, how many, the potential reduction in live releases. And then also any seasonal closure might shift effort to other species or shift effort to other times of the year. So sort of going back to Addendum 6, Addendum 6 did not consider any seasonal closures as part of the management options, although 2 jurisdictions, Maryland and the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, did implement no targeting closures for striped bass through their Addendum 6 conservation equivalency programs. So both of those jurisdictions implemented those no targeting closures in the summer when the release mortality rates are relatively higher due to environmental conditions. And those no targeting closures are still in place now as part of Addendum 2. So Draft Amendment 7 did consider seasonal closures. Primarily, it considered no targeting closures. There were and there continue to be several concerns about the enforceability or unenforceability of no targeting closures. But at the time during Amendment 7, it was assumed that no targeting closures would have the maximum reduction of effort, and so therefore the maximum reduction in releases if that was what the board was trying to achieve. So most of the options in Draft Amendment 7 were no targeting closures. Another concern with no targeting closures is there is currently not a standardized method for estimating the reduction from no targeting closures. That estimated reduction depends on different assumptions about angler behavior, which is really difficult to predict. So in addition to the type of closure in Amendment 7, so no targeting or no harvest, the board also considered the geographic scope of potential seasonal closures. So the Draft Amendment 7 PDT did put forward options for coastwide closures, regional closures, and state-by-state closures. Prior to the document going out for public comment, the board did remove the coastwide and regional closure options. The board noted that they would support states having the flexibility to choose their own closure dates. And there was particular concern about requiring sort of a blanket wave 4 closure along the coast and the differential impacts that would have. And then for regional closures, there was concern about how to define the different regions and avoid the issue of having different closure dates in shared water bodies. So the Draft Amendment 7 for public comment included option for state-specific no targeting closures. It also included some options for spawning closures, but ultimately the board decided not to include any closures in Amendment 7. Again, the board brought up enforceability concerns with no targeting closures and also noted that on the spawning closure front that the existing spawning closures were adequate. So most recently, Draft Addendum 2, last year, the plan development team did put forward options that combined size limit changes and no harvest closures. So when the board was reviewing that initial document, there was a discussion and the board did vote to add an option that would allow those closures to be designated as no targeting. But then following that board discussion, the board ultimately voted to remove all seasonal closure options from the draft addendum. So Draft Addendum 2 ultimately did not have any options for seasonal closures. So that wraps up my presentation. Again, as the chair mentioned, the board action for consideration today is to approve a task for a potential board work group on release mortality. And up here on the screen, on the next slide in the meeting materials, the chair did put forward a couple of potential tasking questions to start the board discussion on this work group. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Emily. So we'll kind of combine here, both questions for Emily, and then I think also get into the discussion given the time. And I'll just note the work group ideas or tasks are just a conversation starter. This is property of the board. So if folks would like to suggest something new, different, or eliminate something, that's all within the purview of the board's discussion today. So any questions or comments as we work to identify a task list for the work group? Adam Nowalski.
Thank you very much. I would just request that under reviewing the existing non-target enclosures for striped bass, that specifically include consultation with our federal partners that have worked with states law enforcement as well for a long time, enforcing the non-targeting from 3 to 200 miles offshore. I think they could provide a lot of information about the number of cases that they've already made, number of interactions that they've had. I think that would be highly informative as to answering the question of, is this enforceable and at what level it is enforceable?
Thank you, Adam. Any other comments? I'm not seeing any questions. Any comments on the work group tasking? Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm looking at the third bullet that you have there. Identify assessment, sensitivity runs, et cetera. For instance, how low would you have to reduce the release mortality rate in order to see a viable reduction in removals with the same level of effort? I think another thing that we need to look at, based somewhat on the presentation that we saw from Mike just a few minutes ago, and that's still inconclusive, but what I'm seeing there is that the mortality rate doesn't change too much between J hooks and circle hooks, and even with bait. You know, it's a little bit higher with bait and with double, treble hooks, but the rate doesn't change all that much. So I think the other thing we need to look at there is not only how much do we have to reduce the release mortality rate, but how much do we have to reduce releases?
Thanks, Emerson. We're just writing notes, so if there's a pause, that's why. I was just saying we're writing notes, so if there's a pause, that's why. Any other comments on this? If there's not, oh, Jay, go for it.
Yeah, I think the last bullet here up on the slide is really interesting. I don't think it's trivial though. I mean, I don't know that this is maybe a super quick one to figure out, but it's really interesting. I think it would be really valuable to kind of go through that and kind of understand the sensitivity to. So there's two ways. I think when I first read it, I was thinking sensitivity to this 9% assumption, and you can kind of, you know, bounce around and use different assumptions, apply it to the releases and kind of look at that. But on second read, I think it's more about kind of understanding how big a difference would it have to be before you start seeing actual population level effects. Both would be interesting. I don't think either of them are super simple analyses. So I don't know, it may be, I don't know how to, I almost feel like it would be a good one for pushing out in like an RFP, like even a small-ish one, but to have like a grad student work on for a semester or something like that. But I just wanted to offer, it's a really good one. I think it would be super valuable.
So for sure, I think if you guys recall, we actually did a series of sensitivity runs where we looked at using a different release mortality assumption rate for the assessment of you know, instead of the 9%, what if we used a lower one? What if we used a higher one? What if we used a higher one in the bay during the summer and the regular 9% the rest of the year? And sort of back over the history of the assessment. And the results in that were sort of what you would expect, which is that it just scales the population up and down, but the trend and the status were the same. So in my mind, this one would be more about when we do the projections, you know, we do the projections under, let's say we're going to assume a constant mortality rate or a constant level of removals. And that level of removals is based on maybe historical stuff or whatever we think, you know, how many are going to be released. And if we can reduce that sort of level of removals by a small amount due to the reduction in release mortality, how does that affect your rebuilding timeline? How does that affect your population trajectory? And so I think, you know, for sure we could get real deep in the weeds on this, but I think there are maybe some simpler approaches that we could consider just through the projection approach, of which I think would get maybe at Emerson's question as well, of what is the trade-off between if we get released down to 7%, is that better or more effective than, let's say, reducing trips by 10% or reducing, total removal or total releases by X%, or like, what is there? Can we see a trade-off there? But I agree that, there's probably future work that could be done to really dig into that. But I think there's some stuff we can do in the short term that would still be valuable.
I have Justin Davis and then Mike Louisi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Potential addition to the task list here might be to conduct some level of public scoping about public attitudes about some of the potential options in here. And I'm thinking ahead to where we might be going later this year. In addendum 2, we voted up that option that gives the board the ability to take board action this fall when we see the stock assessment, if it's determined we need further reductions in F to meet our rebuilding goals. I think it's possible the board might want to take some things out of this list and adopt them this fall, because frankly, we're sort of running out of room for things to do from a regulatory standpoint to reduce F. We're not going to be able to go through our standard addendum process. If we take board action, we're going to have to take quick action. There might be some opportunity to go out to our public and ask for opinions, but I think having some idea going into that of what the public thinks about some of these things like non-targeting closures, restrictions on terminal tackle might be helpful to us this fall. So it seems like there's maybe some easy ways to get, public input on some of these online surveys, that kind of thing. So that's something to consider.
Thanks, Justin. Mike Louisi and then Emerson Hasbro.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Justin basically went over what it was I wanted to highlight. And while you're sidebarring with Emily, I just had a quick question for you. You or Emily, I know you and I have spoken about the timeline that you envision for this working group to start meeting. Can you quickly go over that in anticipation for what might end up being a list of alternatives that would be considered for some future, maybe sooner than we'd like, but some future restriction on harvest?
Yeah, absolutely, Mike. So after we approve, or assuming we approve a task list today for the work group, we'll send out an email asking for those who are interested in participating in the work group. So we'll identify the work group. I'm hoping we can have at least one meeting before the August board meeting. And in terms of the draft task list so far, I think those assessment sensitivity runs are the most time sensitive because we would need to provide that to the TC by the August board meeting. And then I believe that the work group would continue to work up until the annual meeting, which is when we would get the stock assessment. So my hope is that the work group's tasks would be completed by the annual meeting. Mike.
Yeah, thank you for that. Puts it into perspective. And just to add on one slight comment, one small comment to what Justin was getting to with the public scoping of these ideas. I think if we were to go to the public and ask for some thought back from the public regarding reducing discard mortality, I really like the idea of this trade-off that Dr. Drew was just discussing about where's the line on the trade-off. I feel like if you go out to the public with a blanket statement, what would you rather give up, the harvested fish or the catch and released fish? You're going to get a very split opinion. However, if there was a trade-off between the two, you might find some common ground that we could use as a board at the next phase of any type of management action we need to take. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Emerson?
Thank you. Just building a little bit on Justin's suggestion about scoping and stakeholder input. Would it be possible to have AP representation on a working group? Is that within the scope of what we can do? Have the AP appoint somebody to participate?
Tony, go for it.
Thank you, Emerson. So the guidelines for work groups state that work groups are supposed to be composed of board members. It is up to the chair to appoint the work group members, and that we sometimes bring in outside board members to provide information to work groups, but typically that is not what board work groups do, have participation for non-board members on them.
Thanks, Emerson. We were just chatting up here. Yeah, my intent is to likely keep the work group to board members, but I do think it may be helpful for some of our discussions to have an enforcement representative join the meeting, or another idea is we could have an AP meeting prior to the annual meeting if we're looking for scoping or AP involvement in the process leading up to the assessment. Max Appelman.
Thank you, Chair. I'm thinking about the non-targeting closures, and I know working with the technical committee, one of the struggles that they have is how to account for how anglers are responding to a closure like that. I'm wondering if there's a space within this work group, or if it's even the right place to do that, to try to shed some light on angler response and sort of help the TC work with, better understand angler response in those calculations and give us a better, a more accurate way of calculating what reduction we might realize from no targeting provision.
Yeah, thanks, Max. I think that could potentially fall under this first task, and sort of asking Maryland and the Potomac River for any information or data they have based on their current no targeting closures and how that may have shifted effort or changed angler behavior. As far as sort of asking anglers how they might change their behavior, I don't know. I think maybe we could consider that as part of, if there's some sort of public survey that the work group ends up pursuing, but I think that would be harder. It would be definitely difficult in sort of a hypothetical.
Yeah, I don't know what the makeup of this work group is or what it might be, but even just bringing the knowledge of those work group members, bringing that to the table to sort of inform, hey, how do anglers respond? How would you think they would respond? If there's anything to pull out from that to help inform this discussion and advance the tools that we might have available to us in the future.
Thanks, Max. Adam Nowalski.
Building on Max's comment, I would offer that the work group could seek to pursue a literature review of any interaction between seasonal closures, their result in angler behavior of pursuing non-targeting, and what that non-targeting has resulted in terms of discouraging effort entirely or shifting of effort. I don't know what else might be out there, but I think some literature review for other species or other areas might be beneficial. And on this idea of some type of survey, if the work group is uncomfortable making those assertions about what they think would happen themselves, I think laying out some groundwork for what that survey could look like and how it would be administered would be helpful to come back to us so we could think about how we could potentially implement getting that information.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands. I think we've had a good discussion here, certainly added to the list. So I think we'd be looking for a motion to approve the work group task list as we've discussed today. And I would just maybe ask for the board's flexibility. Some of these ideas may be a lot of work. So just trying to match the time we have with what the board can accomplish, and hearing definitely some interest in scoping, but maybe one of the tasks of the work group can be starting that discussion, and we'll come back in August with some more ideas on how that could be carried out. So if the board is comfortable with that, Emily's going to review verbally what she thinks we've said.
So yeah, just to make sure I'm clear on the task list. So starting with the first one on the screen, review existing no targeting closures, including any information on impacts to striped bass catch and an effort, as well as their enforceability. So as sort of sub bullets to that first bullet, we had the request to work with our federal partners to get information on sort of federal enforcement of no targeting. And also, as was just brought up, for the work group to think about, what does the work group think, or is there any literature out there on what angler response or change in behavior would be with no targeting closure. So that's sort of the first bullet with some specifics added on. Then we have the second bullet, review the DMF discard mortality study, which we just heard about, and other relevant reports to evaluate the efficacy of potential gear modifications. Then we have the third bullet, to identify assessment sensitivity runs, which may inform the board discussion around release mortality. And as Emerson and Dr. Drew brought up, sort of the trade-off of release mortality rate versus reducing the number of releases. And then there's a fourth bullet that was added, which is considering public scoping on these topics. And I think realistically, I think the work group could maybe talk about what that might look like, maybe in the form of a survey, and come back. And we could also talk with Tina and the communication staff and come back in August to check back in on that topic. So I have sort of these 3 bullets on the screen, plus that additional public outreach bullet. Do folks feel that that has captured the discussion? Okay, great.
All right. So at this point, we would be looking for a motion to approve the work group task list as discussed today. Emerson, are you making that motion? Thank you. Mike Luisi, a second.
Do you want me to read it into the record?
Yes, please, Emerson. Thank you.
Move to approve the tasks for the board work group on recreational release mortality as discussed today.
All right. I think we've had a robust discussion here. Is there any burning comments folks need to make on this motion? Seeing none, is there any opposition to this motion? Seeing none, it is approved by unanimous consent. Thank you very much, everyone. So our next agenda item is to review and populate the advisory panel membership. And I'll look to Tina.
Thank you. I offer for your consideration and approval the nomination of Peter Jenkins, a recreational angler from Rhode Island, to the Striped Bass Advisory Panel.
Thank you, Tina. Is anyone willing to make a motion for Peter Jenkins? Jason McAmey.
Yep, thank you, Madam Chair. I make, it's up there. Move to approve Peter Jenkins of Rhode Island to the Atlantic Striped Bass Advisory Panel. And I'll talk a little more about Peter really quickly if I get a second.
You got a second from Justin Davis, so go for it, Jason.
Yeah, so Peter's a great guy. I've known him for a while. He's active, participates, he's engaged, and he'll be a really good addition to the advisory panel. So yeah, hopefully folks will agree.
Thanks, Jason. Is there any discussion on this motion? Seeing none, is there any objection to this motion? Seeing none. All right, welcome, Peter. Next is to elect a vice chair. Do I have any nominations for the vice chair slot? Marty Gary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It'd be my honor to nominate as the next vice chair for the Atlantic Striped Bass Management Board, Mr. Chris Bat-Savage from the state of North Carolina.
Thank you. And you have a second from Pat Gear. Any discussion on this motion? Any objection to the motion? All right, welcome, Chris, to the vice chair slot. All right, so we're on to other business. A few things here. I think Emily's just going to give some reminders for how we're going to proceed with the work group.
Thanks, Chair. So we will send out an email asking for board member volunteers to be part of the work group. I believe in the work group guidelines. Ultimately, it's up to the board chair if we have, a much larger group of individuals who've expressed interest than would be manageable for a work group. So we will keep everyone updated on the work group membership. And then, as Chair mentioned, I think the goal would be for the work group to sort of get started on these tasks and come back to the board in August with an update. And if there's any sort of initial recommendations from the work group or the work group needs further clarification, we can do that in August. So we will reach out following this meeting.
Thanks, Emily. Next, John Clark, I believe you had an item under other business.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just briefly, some bad news, actually. We're seeing mycobacteriosis in our spring gillnet catch. Craig just had some experience with this, and I've heard from my colleagues in Maryland that you're seeing it in the Ocean City catch, and their fish pathologist has pretty much confirmed that it is myco. So, Craig, what would you say the percentage was of that you were saying?
It's according to whether you want to call it bad enough to throw back where it's not marketable. But
but the more marketable stuff that you could recognize it in under the scales that have not been lost yet, it's somewhere between 5 to 10%. I generally fish from the first week of April to the last week of April. So we just did finish up this. I usually catch somewhere between 500-600 fish, and at least 5 to 10% were showing signs of this. Or there was at least 10 fish, I believe, that were not marketable, where the lesions were certainly bad enough that we couldn't sell them. We try to target a fish primarily between 26 and 38 inches, mainly because the New York market is our most lucrative market. So that's the size fish that, I can say that we sampled primarily. Those fish weigh somewhere between 10 to 20 pounds on average. 15 to 17 is a pretty close average in that fish. It's recognized. It's not the first time. It's nothing new. I have fished for striped bass over a 40-year period of my life, maybe longer. That was pre-moratorium, through moratorium, and post-moratorium. And I have recognized this at least 4, maybe 5 different times in the fishery over a number of years. To us as fishermen, it is recognized as a overpopulation of the species. And the only time that it seems to resolve itself is when there is a reduction in the population. And then it seems to clear back up again. So I don't know I know it's been blamed on a lot of things. Hell, at one time they blamed it on our chicken farmers. Don't really think it had much to do with the chicken farmers, but at any rate, it has come, it has gone. This year, it did show a significant increase over the last 5-8 years. It may or may not, show back up next year. We'll see. Fish were plentiful, easy to catch. We fish with less gear for less time each and every year in the last 10 years. I know that kind of flies in the face of what this commission has put out there. But those are the facts that, as I see them, I know it's often described as anecdotal information, but it is real information, and it's not necessarily the peaks and valleys from an MRIP study. But these are as factual as I can get. And now we've discussed hooks a lot. I can also say I had 2 incidences with hook fish this year. One was a circle hook that was snagged by the sinker. The sinker was the type that you put in the sand with the wires off. I don't recall the name of that, but that was a circle hook that was retrieved off. And the only reason why that fish was caught was because of the sinker. The fish had moved through the lease and entangled up. The second was a 6-inch minnow, surface minnow with 2 treble hooks in the mouth. Both were in the mouth. They both fish were alive and well, but hooked. And the only reason why they were caught in the gill net was because they were previously hooked. And it looked as though both of those instances were because of weak fluorocarbon or monofilament use at the other end. It had parted and failed on both of those instances. It's not unusual for me to catch anywhere from 2 to 6 hooked fish every year. That's sort of, we have a collection. We collect them, 40, 50, sometimes some guys have up to 100 different hooks that we find out of these fish. So I'm willing to answer any questions or observations that you may have. Thank you.
Yeah, Craig, we wanted to warn people that it's out there, and also remind everybody that MICO is transmittable to humans. That's fish handler's disease, and it can cause some really nasty infections. So just be on the lookout.
Thank you, John and Craig, for bringing that to the board's attention. The last thing I have under other business today is just to acknowledge that it is Mike Armstrong's last Striped Bass board meeting. So I want to thank Mike for all of your immense contributions to this board, as was very evident by your presentation today. We really appreciate your enthusiasm for this species and your commitment to the science, and you'll be missed. So thank you very much.
Hear, hear.
A wise old man once told me, don't ever bypass a hot mic. Yeah, I'm overwhelmed like last night, and it's been my honor. This board it's incredible what we do. We take a lot of flack. The work is immensely hard and we don't all agree, but at the end we get good results. You know, I'm looking forward to retirement, but this will be what I miss most of my career is sitting on this board. So I wish you luck. There are huge challenges. This is actually a really great time to get the hell off this board because good luck, Nick. So thank you. Thank you for any recognition and all the help you've given me. And I've learned a lot just sitting but it's been my honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. We've certainly learned a lot from you as well. All right, I think that is it today. Is there a motion to adjourn? So moved. Thank you.